radio for the masses.
Headline edition, July 8, 1947. The Army Air Forces has announced that a flying disc has been found and is now in the possession of the Army.
If the game is rigged, change the game. Game changer.
I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world.
This is Fade to Black with your host, Jimmy Church, on the Game Changer Radio Network and KGRA, the Global Radio Alliance.
I need your help to get to the year 1985.
You're listening to Fade to Black with Jimmy Church on the Game Changer Network.
Good evening. Fade to Black. Bespoke radio for the masses. Good evening. It is Tuesday, August 20th, 2019. 231 days into the new year, just 134 days left. We are live from a bunker somewhere in the middle of beautiful downtown Burbank, California. And I would like to welcome everybody listening all around the world, all across the United States. Hither and thither, to and fro, back and forth, up and down, east and west, north and south, far and near. This is Fade to Black for KJCR, the Game Changer Network, and KGRA, the planets. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. What is cracking, everybody? How you doing? How you doing? How you doing? All right. Yeah. Man, I had an amazing day today. Just an amazing day. Flame 2.0 update. Got the guitar painted today. Posted pictures up over on Facebook, and there's some stuff over on Twitter, but head over to my Facebook page. I got a bunch of shots there. But that wasn't the most amazing thing that happened. The most amazing thing that happened was the video of the guitar dude that I shot at the entrance to the 405 freeway, and he came up to my car. I flipped him a $5, and he sang me a song, some Tom Petty, and it was just magical. I see this guy all the time, and I know I know he sees my car coming, and as evidenced in this video, but nonetheless, right there on the side of the road, man, magic, and it was just really, really cool. So go to my Facebook page and check out the video. I'll see if I can get it up on Twitter. I don't know how to do that. You can post videos to Twitter, right? I guess. I don't know if I've ever done it. I barely figured out how to. I figured out today you could post more than one picture to Twitter. I know, right? Right. I always thought for some reason that you could only post 2 pictures to Twitter, and I would see people post more than that, and I used to think up until today, how do they do that? And today I just went, wow, it did 3. Will it do 4? There you go. I guess I got to post more pictures today. Welcome tonight, Tuesday. Our guest is Freddy Silva. All right, welcome back. Fade to Black. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. Tonight, Freddy Silva. Tomorrow night, Francisco Osa. Thursday night, it is the film Extraordinary, the Seating with director Joe Sumple and writer Jack Roth. That's right. No Fader night this week, but we'll take some of your phone calls tomorrow night with Francisco Osa. But tonight is Freddy Silva. He's a best-selling author, leading researcher of ancient civilizations, restricted history, sacred sites, and their interaction with consciousness. He's also a leading expert on crop circles. He has published 6 books in 6 languages, and he was described by one CEO as perhaps the best metaphysical speaker in the world right now. For 2 decades, he has been an international keynote speaker with notable appearances at the International Science and Consciousness Conference, the International Society for the Study of Subtle Energies and Energy Medicine, and the Association for Research and Enlightenment. In addition to appearances on Gaia Television, History Channel, BBC, and radio shows such as Coast to Coast and Fade to Black. He's also a documentary filmmaker. He's a photographer and leads private tours to sacred sites in England, France, Egypt, Portugal, Yucatan, Malta, Peru, Bolivia, and Scotland. Tonight, we're going to talk about his new book, The Missing Lands, which examines the origin of the gods before the Great Flood 11,000 years ago. And I would like to welcome back to Fade to Black, Freddy Silva. Freddy, good evening. How are you?
Jimmy, good to be on again.
Hey, Freddie, it's so good to hear your voice. I had mentioned in the opening of the show, I wonder if you remember this, but a few years ago, I called you up, and out of the blue, you happened to pick up the phone. We had a great, 2-hour conversation, and at the end of the conversation, I said, hey, you want to come on the show next week? And you said, Jimmy, I'm on my way to Scotland. I'm going to research there for a few months. I've got to go here. Why don't we circle back next year in 12 months? Do you remember that?
It's a big fade. The whole year seems to have just disappeared in some strange cosmic dark hole of writing and research and airplanes. My chiropractor hates me. In fact, he makes a lot of money out of me because I'm very, very tall. I don't fit on normal airplane seats, and my God, it's been a strange year, but it has been worth it, I have to say. Do
you know what kind of dark hole you dropped me in? I was so excited. And I thought, man, I can't wait a year, but I had to.
Think about all the people that had to wait 5 years for the book to come out. I had a bet that I was going to bring it out a year ago because every time my good friend Graham Hancock brings out a book, all of ours suddenly become obsolete. So I figured, no, this time I'm going to get mine out first. Well, I spent 2 months in New Zealand doing some extra research, found out all kinds of interesting things there, and I thought, this is going to have to wait. And would you believe it? We both released the book on the same day. Oh, well, that's the way the gods like to mess around with it. But, we're following very similar tracks. I mean, we're all adding, more meat to the stew. So thank God for that. I think the story is getting more exciting year by year.
Yeah, it would be, the same thing like in rock and roll where your record company goes, well, good news. We're going to release your record next week. Yay. On the same day Led Zeppelin drops their reunion album.
Exactly.
It's just like,
I think this is sort of a joke that pretty much all rock and rollers are failed art students, with the exception of Mick Jagger, who was an accountant. And all failed rock and rollers all end up being, Xerox copy machine repair people or something.
I've done both.
It's very, very weird, strange universe.
I've done both, but you're right about that. When I was, you're so right about that, because when I was trying to learn how to play guitar, but I was an artist, right? I was going to art school, and I was, it's what I did for my job. And Jimmy Page and so many others went through art school before their rock and roll careers. So I thought, okay, all right, so I'm doing this the right way. And but look what I'm doing today.
Yeah, here we are.
Yeah,
exactly.
Here we are.
I had the same thing. I was art school as well. I thought I had a great career lined up in rock and roll. I had the hair halfway down my shoulders. I looked like the Italian version of Jesus. Ever makes you wonder why Jesus is always painted as a white guy? It never seems to frustrate anybody.
Right, right.
So I had the look, I had the pose, but you know what? Deep down, I knew that I just didn't have what it takes to have a little push over the cliff. I mean, when you're good, you know you're good. But, you could keep up with other people, but that's not good enough. And, I took an alternative reality and went back to my other good thing that I was good at, which was writing and sticking my nose in places where I shouldn't be sticking it and finding out all kinds of unusual things. So I think we're all born to do something, and we get sidetracked into all these things, and eventually we come back full circle to where we're supposed to be anyway.
Well, and the creative mind is the creative mind, where because of your openness to art and music and other things, and I know this is the case because I'm the same way, and I know so many others that are just like the two of us, in that you now explore. You don't stay confined inside of the box. So you start to question reality. You write about it, right? You paint about it.
Exactly. I mean, you have to. If I look back at most of the people on my bookshelf, all the people I admire over the years, they had this very much the same open look of, drawing in as much information as you can from many different subject areas to hopefully end up at the truth, because the truth ultimately only resides with the people who were there in the first place. We're trying to approximate the truth. So the more you can draw from different points of view, not your own, there are too many personal opinions flying around, I think, being sort of passed off as fact. I like to hear what other people have to say. I want to hear what geologists have to say. I want to know what historians have to say, and linguists. And when you sort of put yourself out of the picture and look at all of these things, you begin to connect the dots. And that's pretty much what, art does. It connects dots. It looks in disparate places to see how things connect. And then you just project and see where it goes, cast some dice, and let yourself go where the paint takes you or where the music takes you. And you find if you just get out of the way, it has a way of leading you in some very interesting places. So, most of the authors that even I appreciate also come from a very similar background of inquiry and just letting the facts speak for themselves.
Do you remember, take me to the moment where you had that epiphany, where you went, okay, something's not quite right here. What was that moment? I mean, I have mine. What was your moment where you went, okay, now I need to start to question everything. Things aren't quite right. What happened?
Oh, I was doing it when I was 3. I was drawing pyramids. That isn't right for 3-year-old children. I was getting regularly beaten up even in kindergarten. I knew that there was something not quite right about this planet, or at least the people who live here. And I was gathering information as I went through high school and college. I was buying books on, Peter Tompkins' The Great Pyramid was one of my first books that I ever bought. And I spent 2 hours outside London Museum back in the early 70s when the Tutankhamun exhibit showed up. I was at the front of the queue. It was raining, of course, because it was London. And I tell you, it was when I stared at that face, at that mask in gold, back in the days where you could stand in front of it without being moved along by the guards, I knew something was very different. I knew that my life was going to be very different. I just didn't know how. I was seduced by all kinds of other things, as we all are. But eventually, this is where I ended up. And over the course of the years, when I spent 14 years in advertising and graphics and information, I was very good at what I did, but I wasn't happy. And every time I got laid off, it gave me a chance to go back and re-examine my life, and I would have these experiences. For example, I remember very clearly the night when back in the mid-90s when I began to research crop circles, and I was helping out at the time the world's only acknowledged expert, who was Colin Andrews, and Pat Delgado as well. I became great friends with him. And I had my own experience where I wasn't really searching for anything. I didn't know what was going on. I was just inquiring. And in the middle of a field, in the middle of a night, one night, I was lying down, just having a quiet sort of thinking about how does this all tie together. And I still remember being levitated off the ground. And I'm not kidding you. If anybody thinks this is a typo, I was levitated off the ground. I was taken out of body. I met the original circle makers, extraordinary people, and I've been in touch with them ever since. It's been part of my life, and that woke me up. It made me give up my life, a 14-year-old marriage, which was really, quite good back then. And I just gave up everything to go on this search to find out there's something much bigger here than me and all of us, and it's trying to tell us something. And after that, it was just a matter of sitting down and saying, well, I give up my control in life. I'm in complete trust. Let's see where we go. My God, when you say that and under such circumstances, things take on a very different look. And I call them the fringe benefits, because they are fringe benefits. I've seen people since then coming out of the walls of the Great Pyramid. I don't expect these things to happen. They happen, and there are people there to witness it. So when you're in that kind of environment, when these strange things happen, and you're able to talk about them in a very methodical way and write about them and put the connections together, that's how my life has been as a researcher. It's come from direct experience, and then having the time to sit down, find the science and the facts to back all of this up and create a story. That's the hard part. You have to spend a lot of time in libraries. You have to talk to a lot of people, look for information in strange places, but somehow it's there. And I always felt very guided by this. I always give credit to whoever's pulling the strings behind me, because I have complete trust that every time I ask a question, there will be an answer there. But of course, you have to do the work. You have to put the time in, and that's what makes it fun.
When you read growing up, and we've all done it, where you read these accounts, just like what you just described, right? These fantastic accounts, and you read about it from other people, and you go, okay, all right, this is a bit too much. This is crazy talk. But then you at some point have your own experiences. And then you realize that those people that you were maybe dismissing in the past weren't so crazy, but now you are in a position of having to write and speak about it yourself, becoming one of the crazy people that you read about in the past. Was that easy to do and to make that transition? I mean, you've got to come out of the closet at some point, right?
And we are the majority.
I know, right.
Indeed. Yes, no. I again, if you go back in time and you think you'd had a bit more common sense when you're younger, but then again, we're doing the best we can. We incarnate, and because we incarnate, it's because we're not perfect. If I had the common sense that I have now, 30 years ago, I would have done things differently, and I would have looked upon people who had UFO experiences with a bit more respect. And I acknowledge that. There are people who I would listen to the stories and I go, well, wait a minute, there's something very important about this. I remember meeting Travis Walton, for example. And in fact, we were playing guitar together at the Contact in the Desert last year. And it's kind of funny. He's a lovely guy. And I tell you, the first time I met him, I looked into his eyes, and I'm sure everybody's familiar with the story of Travis and how he was literally taken on board a ship, and he was actually killed. They killed him by accident, and they had to resuscitate him and bring him back to Earth. And I look in his eyes, and you cannot mistake fear. You really cannot. And this guy's gone from something very harrowing, and he's taking it on very, very well. So, yes, I do. I was at a time when I would laugh at some people, but there were some others where I did have enough common sense to realize something here doesn't quite add up. These people would not give up their entire lives to be ridiculed, and that's what made it true for me. So I do have a lot more respect for them now, being in the same situation. And the way I try to handle it is not, people ask me all the time, well, what happened when you went and left the body, when you met circle makers, or how you describe the people that you saw coming out of the stones in the King's Chamber? And I try to keep it actually very sane, very quiet. I don't really sort of go on TV and make a big show about it. If someone wants to ask me, I'll tell them. And I want to try and keep humble about it, because you can go both ways here. You can either develop great humility, or you get a big ego out of it. I want to go with a bit more humility, I think. I think it makes the story a bit more genuine, and also the fact that I'm not trying to capitalize on it in any way also makes it more genuine. So I definitely do understand what other people are going through, because like I said, if you give up your cozy life and your wonderful cars and your guitars and your wife and all of that, and you trade it in for a lot of backstabbing and ridicule, that person's on the right path. It's a difficult path, and those who choose to follow it obviously are the people who we should try and emulate more often.
When all right, I'm just going to go direct here. When the evidence started to come out, it didn't exactly start with John Anthony West and Robert Schoch, but certainly their presentation and documentary, and won an Emmy Award, The Mystery of the Sphinx, and dating it back to approximately 10,500 BC, 11,000 years ago. This number started to pop up. Robert Bivol, Graham Hancock, others and yourself. Others started to look at this date. This date was also discussed prior to that, but it started to take hold. But it wasn't just the Sphinx. When you look at biblical accounts and you looked at different civilizations around the world and reports of a flood, it didn't originate in the Bible. It was actually a worldwide situation. But this date, the same date, started to pop up all over the world. And you, and especially in this new book, you started to chase down this date and different experiences. And let's actually start there.
It pops up all over the place, and the reason why I really wanted to write The Missing Lands is because I felt there was something very big missing in this story about the ancient civilization, and that is the human element. Because when you talk to people as far from Europe as possible, the stories get stranger and stranger, and they actually become much more like eyewitness accounts than myth. And we have to understand what myth is in the context. Myth is nothing more than a theatrical device in which to remember important information.
That's right.
So let's say a spaceman traveling to the other side of the galaxy to fight darkness, well, that's okay, but you're going to forget that in 3 days. But if you wrap that in the story of Star Wars and the redemption of Darth Vader, now you've got a myth and a story that you remember for years and decades to come. So the more you go away into other parts of the world where you question people whose predecessors were closer to the events than we are today, it becomes very apparent when there are overlaps in the stories of people who supposedly never talked to each other that these stories were eyewitness accounts. And case in point was when I was in New Zealand for a few months, I went to a place called the Birthplace of the Gods. Now, if that doesn't tell you something, you're asleep.
Where is it? Where is it?
I've been there 6 times. It's in the South Island. It's not easy to get to, but when you get there, it's another 3-hour climb. And believe me, I can't get enough of it. It's a most beautiful, majestic landscape temple of the most beautiful monoliths. And they've all been carved by hand. There is an actual account now that's been written down. It was published about 10 years ago by the last surviving members of the original people who lived in New Zealand, who were called the Waitaha. Hardly anyone's ever heard about these people. They originally came from Easter Island. And they were saying that, back in the day, there was the gods called the Urukeu. They were very tall, human-like, but not quite like us. And very nice people, teachers, sages, craftsmen, and they basically had a base in the South Island of New Zealand, and it's still there today. And they carved the monuments by hand, and you can still see these weathered faces on the monuments. You can still see where the mauls used to actually strike, where they took bits of rock and sat there and hammered away at the limestone to create these images. And in these images, they carved their stories, their mythologies, and one place was a calendar rock. Now, they didn't tell me exactly where the calendar rock was, and there's 3 sites. That's a lot of rock you have to go and look and hike through. There must be over 10,000 pieces of rock there. And on one of the occasions that I was down there looking for this calendar stone, because I figured if the calendar stone is there, because of the way the monuments are all aligned to the original stars in the date in which they were made, you should be able to get an alignment and therefore back up the story.
Right.
So I was on the 3rd day that I was walking around aimlessly, the only bird in the entire valley, and I mean the only bird in the entire valley, which was a hawk, lands on this rock, which looks like a big pancake with a head stuck coming out of it. And I figured, that kind of looks like a calendar rock. It looks like a big sundial. And I suddenly realized, it's funny because in the Egyptian traditions, whenever you saw a hawk, it was always a sign or a symbol of Horus. And I kind of laughed to myself. I figured, okay, they're having a joke at my expense. And it turns out that it actually was a calendar stone, and it actually was made by hand. And I took the alignments. I was able to plug them into Stellarium, which is a very addictive computer program for, looking at places and moving back the sky thousands of years with great accuracy. And I began to look at connections. And in the mythology of the area, there are two particular constellations which stand out. One's the Southern Cross, of course. The other one is the constellation of Orion. And I'm thinking, this has got to be too good to be true. So the first time that Orion starts actually crossing above this calendar stone, you only see the belt. And that was about 14,000 BC. And I thought, wow, and it's a perfect alignment with the top of the belt. With the top of the calendar stone. And I figured that's quite an astonishing thing. Now, if you roll the sky forwards towards our time, when is the first time that constellation appears behind the background of mountains in its full capacity right over that calendar stone? And would you believe it? It's the winter solstice of 10,400 BC.
No way.
And yes, exactly. I mean, at that point, I realized this book is going to be late coming out, because now we're basically at the same time that they're laying out the pyramids in the Giza, the gods in New Zealand are laying out their temple as well. And the funny thing is, they also are described exactly in the same way. So they're very tall, they're white-skinned, which is unusual in Polynesia, red-haired or blonde-haired, green eyes or blue eyes, and also the elongated skulls. So this is where the story starts developing, because now you've got a possible connection also with the gods of New Zealand. With the gods of Egypt.
Now, how far is Easter Island from the birthplace of the gods in New Zealand?
Oh, it's a long, long row away. And here's the fun part. When they began to describe their oral traditions, the Waitaha was saying that this is before the flood, by the way. So we're now in sometime before 11,000 BC. They were saying that every year the gods would arrive on their waka. A waka is essentially a large catamaran. And if you go to Tonga and Samoa, you'll still see an echo of these incredible fast-moving vessels. And they really are very fast. And they said that the gods would arrive from a big landmass somewhere in the east, which I would take to mean South America. And they would appear there. They would take on water and food, and that they would leave some of their knowledge behind. The wisdom keeper of the Waitaha will put it into this basket, which they call the kete of knowledge. You see these same baskets actually carved on the stones of Göbekli Tepe. That's what those baskets mean. They hold the wisdom of the tribe. And they said that one year the canoe failed to appear when angry stars gathered close to the sun and 7 burning mountains came out of the sky to create the dreaded deluge. And they described the gods having been fortunate enough to have been caught when these meteorites landed on Earth in the water and created huge tidal waves that penetrated as far as the Himalaya. That's 3 miles above sea level, by the way. And they said that it was their fortune to have been in the middle of the ocean when this happened, because they were able to navigate through these enormous waves, because in the middle of the ocean you just get massive swells. Had they been anywhere near dry land, of course, they'd have been destroyed. And that's when they eventually end up in New Zealand. And 2 generations later, they show up back again in Easter Island to reconnoiter the entire Pacific, because all the lands they had known were now underwater. That's an incredible story. Even more so when you read further on, and they said the reason why they built the Moai, because in their story, excuse me, in their story, the Moai appear already there. No one carved them. They're already in the story. So they must have been countlessly old. And they were saying that the Moai were originally the images of these Urukeu gods. And the reason why the oldest Moai, the ones that are made of basalt, and of course the basalt quarry from where it comes from, is underwater and would only have been above sea level before the end of the Younger Dryas, by the way. The reason why these statues had these little red tufa hats, as we call them, is because they were put on there to demonstrate the color of their hair. And later on, when humans took over the governorship of Easter Island thousands of years later, they kept on building the moai, but you notice that there's a different type of statue. They're not quite as sharp, they're not quite as defined, but those younger statues are the ones that actually depict the chiefs of the tribe, which were human. So there are two types of moai on Easter Island, and one depicts the human chiefs, and the other one, the oldest ones, depict the original gods. I had no idea this was even available, and I'm so glad that they finally published their traditions, because it's really opened up a huge story, because their story eventually tracks to South America, and then it gets very much out of control.
Let's take our break right here. Our guest tonight, Freddy Silva. We're talking about his new book, The Missing Lands. I am your host, Jimmy Church. Stay with us. We'll be back and pick up this conversation where we're leaving off right now, right after this short break. Stay with us. All right, welcome back. Fade to Black. Our guest tonight, Freddy Silva. And we're talking about his new book. It is called The Missing Lands. Oh, man. I told this story a couple of weeks ago. I saw Pete Townsend thrash like 4 guitars one night live at a Who concert from feedback in his monitor. It was like, dude.
Yeah, there's one point where they were actually playing and they ran out of guitars. Within a 100-mile radius, they had to send out a search party to buy more Rickenbackers. You sometimes wonder about the logic sometimes.
He was yelling at his monitor guy, right? And I what I thought was about to happen, I was like 15 years old. I thought he was going to bean the monitor guy with a guitar. And I know that monitor guy was totally thinking, I'm about to get, slung by a Les Paul. But anyway.
Richie Blackmore had it right, you see. Whenever he destroyed guitars, he actually did it because the guitars were flawed. They were imperfect models. He hated getting a guitar that was just not perfect. So that's why he thrashed them. And a bit of showmanship, of course. But at least there was a logic behind it.
Hey, let me ask you before I want to get to the gods in a second and flood myths, but in New Zealand. But you're from England. Did you ever bump into any of these guys?
What, musicians?
Yeah.
Oh, God, yeah. I used to drink I had a drink with Robert Plant one evening when we were at working in London. And as always in graphics and advertising, you're always working late. And I turned to a friend of mine in the office and I said, it's about 8 o'clock. I fancy a good gig tonight. I'm really tired. I need some sound. Who's playing at the Marquee? And for anybody who doesn't know the Marquee, it's a tiny club. I mean, you can't hold more than 100 people in there. Very intimate. And he was looking in the paper and it says some band called Robot Planet. Never heard of them. And I went, Robot Planet. Wait a minute, that's an anagram.
Right.
And it turns out it's an anagram for Robert Plant. And he did this all the time. So we showed up at the pub around the back of the Marquee, which we knew would be the usual watering hole. And there he is at the propping up the bar. So we brought him around. We just chit-chatted about this, that, and that, like normal people. Didn't even talk about music. And had a good laugh. And, he's 10 minutes to go. He says, right, break a leg. I'll keep the beer warm when you get back 2 hours later. Thanks, mate. And that was that.
Wow.
We used to watch, when I was at school, we used to watch, because it was right in Chelsea, around Sloane Square and King's Road, which is the big area for all the rock and rollers back in the 70s. We used to watch Mick Jagger and Keith and David Bowie coming out of Bieber, the women's cosmetics store, with a little bag. But of course, it was for their stage gear. That's where they got their makeup from. And we'd wave at them, said, "Thanks for a great album, David. When's the next one? Working on it right now, mate." And it was very chummy. I mean, they were normal people like anybody else. They wanted to be treated like normal people. So, yeah, hanged out with the Stranglers a bit. They used to always sit on the next to Safeway supermarket, just trying to punch people. They're actually a bunch of out-of-work accountants, by the way, but they're ever so nice for punks.
What's funny?
Bride Adams lived down the road. I mean, it was. I once met Freddie Mercury. He just released. What was it? It was Sheer Heart Attack, which is my favorite album. And I was coming home from school, and I went behind these two people, very tall, with long black hair down the back of their shoulders. They looked like gods dressed in black leather from head to foot. And I slowly walked around them, and it was Freddie Mercury, the most beautiful woman I've ever met. I thought, wow. I said, Mr. Mercury, and I'm going, don't say something stupid. I've got all your albums. And he goes, what, all two of them? I said, yeah. Would you mind giving me your autograph? And he did. He was a lovely, lovely guy. So, yeah, that was what was happening in London in the 70s. It was pretty chummy.
You just hit me. That's what's in those Anunnaki purses. Makeup.
Well, autograph.
Yeah, makeup. So, we're
going to pretend to be like human beings. Where's the makeup?
Where's the makeup? Going back to New Zealand. Certainly, if the gods came from South America through Easter Island, eventually to New Zealand, we need to visit that, and we're going to do that in a second. But New Zealand, did they have flood myths?
No, they don't. The only one that, in fact, I should sort of backtrack the story a little bit. The official version is the Maori are indigenous to New Zealand. They show up about 800 years ago. And I was reading the original accounts of the arrival of the Maori there, and they said, well, when we arrived in New Zealand, there were people welcoming us on the shore. Well, you've just basically undermined the credibility that you were the first people there. And it's a matter of huge controversy to the point where my book is being refused to be reviewed in New Zealand. For this very fact, because the history is being whitewashed. So no surprises there. And it turns out that the only flood myth really comes from the Waitaha, who so far one of 13 indigenous people, and so far they appear to be the oldest, because their story goes that at least they can place themselves in Easter Island all the way back then, along with another tribe called the Ngāti Hotu, of which very little is known about. The only claim to fame, which I actually put into the book, was the fact that they don't look like Polynesians. They look like Egyptians with red hair and green eyes. And one of the grandmothers of the Ngāti Hotu actually talks about similar stories, which they said they got from somebody else, possibly the Waitaha, and they actually had their DNA tracked, and it confirmed their oral tradition that they originally came from Persia, the Middle East, and Egypt. They migrated down to Madagascar, went around the bottom of Africa, settled in the Yucatan, where they helped construct a few pyramids. You may have heard of a few of them. They then migrated down to South America, lived around Lake Titicaca, and then they migrated to Easter Island, which is not exactly an easy ride. And then from there, they ended up in New Zealand, and their DNA tracks absolutely perfectly. And that was done by the National Geographic DNA gene survey. So at least we can trust that. So no, the only story that comes of the flood from New Zealand actually comes from the people who originally settled there after the third generation of the great-grandsons of the gods, who most of which didn't make it through the flood.
So the builders of the monuments and the temples at Titicaca, and including Pumapunku, were the builders at Easter Island and eventually New Zealand. Is that what we're suggesting?
According to their stories, they said that yes, they used to basically use they used to use Easter Island as a midway stop to go to the birthplace of the gods, and then because of the way that the currents work, they couldn't make it back to New Zealand. They had to go all the way back to Chile, to Tiwanaku. And one of the biggest connections that really set off the story for me was that they said that when they took this enormous voyage from New Zealand all the way to the big continent in the east, or the big land in the east, they called it. I'm trying to think of the name that they called it, but it's escaping me right now. It's Kainga Tuitui, I believe they called it. They said that the gods used to take 2 totem birds with them as a symbol of good luck. And one bird was called Titi and the other one was called Kaka. In fact, Kaka is actually a kind of a parrot, still there in New Zealand today. And that, of course, became the name of lent itself to the name of the lake or where they built their original home, which was Lake Titicaca. And if we start tracking the rest of the story there, we're now sort of onto the point of the Aymara. They talk about a guy called Virakosha, a god-man, who shows up with 7 craftspeople. One of them was a woman who was also his sister and his wife, although I suggest that this is more symbolic than actual, that he actually mated with his own sister. But, then again, we never know because there's a lot of intermarrying back then. But the same story appears in New Zealand, in Easter Island, because they said that after the flood, there were these children of the gods reappeared to rebuild these former mansions of the gods, and they were led by one charismatic leader and 7 craftspeople. And in South America, at Titicaca, they describe them exactly in the same way as the Waitaha described the Urukeu in New Zealand. So I'm suggesting that perhaps they're the same people. Now, there's an Egyptian thread that runs through all of this, and that is that one of the people that shows up in Easter Island after the flood, the grandson of the gods, his name was Maui. And he was the one that was leading all these expeditions across the Pacific to chart the missing lands, where there had been big land masses. There were now just the tips of mountains, small islands. Well, Maui is actually an Egyptian name. It means navigator. And also, the word appears in the Hopi language, who also date their flood tradition to the middle of the Pacific. The word means to descend. And it's always been said that the sons of the gods descended from the sky. So we have a connection here, a linguistic connection. The other big connection is the name of the place called Tiwanaku that we know so well. It's not a Aymara name. It comes from Polynesia, and it means my people, the place of my people. Now, I was talking to my guide in the Andes, who happens to be an Aymara gentleman, lovely guide, and we were talking about language and how we get to know so much more when you understand the meaning of the words in its original format, not the way that we have been given the words, because they've all been changed and anglicized and so forth. And he said, Tiwanaku means the place of my people or the city of my people. And I pointed out, but you do realize that the syllable aku, is that an Aymara syllable? And he says, actually, it's not. Where would that come from? I said, well, that's an Egyptian word. It means shining one of the shining people. So technically, Tiwanaku literally means the city of my shining people. And that's why he said, well, you do realize that the name of the craftspeople that show up at Virakosha, they were called the Haiwaiwapanti. There'll be a test at the end of this program.
Yes, I'm right with you. I'm right with.
And I said, so what does Haiwaiwapanti mean? They said, well, it means shining ones. So we sat there mesmerized by this. One of those moments, a big aha moments, when I realized I've got a big book to write here. Because now they're saying that Virakosha and his Haiwaipanti, who are shining people, are the same ones that you'll find not just in Easter Island and New Zealand, but they're also the same people that you find in Egypt when they escaped their first sinking of their island nation, when the Younger Dryas first began in about 10,800 BC. And they were marching up and down the Nile, building mounds upon which, and I'm quoting this now from the building text in Edfu, they were building the mounds upon which would stand the future temples, the ones that we see today. And the names of these gods were called the Aku Shemsu Hor, which means shining ones, followers of Horus. So now you just basically in one short step linked the gods of Egypt, or the gods who arrived in Egypt from a missing land somewhere, possibly in the Indian Ocean, who were able to sail across the oceans all the way to Titicaca. We used to connect to Easter Island and also used to have a way station in the South Island of New Zealand. That's connecting half of the world with 4 different groups of gods who turns out are the same people.
Now, what about similarities for their monuments and their temples and statues? Certainly we know what exists on Easter Island. We know what is at Titicaca and Pumapunku and certainly Egypt and other sites, but New Zealand is something different altogether, or is it not? Were there similarities in their monuments?
The only monuments that we can be certain of are the ones at the birthplace of the gods, which were essentially carved or hand carved from the living rock. There is one anomalous structure. You've got to remember that New Zealand is a very, very volcanic place. Whenever anything blows there, and mostly on the North Island, basically the whole island gets covered in a foot of ash. So if you multiply that by 10,000 years, you can see where the problem goes. There is one wall, though. They call it the Kaimanawa Wall. It's not far from a very volatile volcano on the North Island of New Zealand, not far from Lake Taupo. And I had a chance to go there one of my first trips to New Zealand over 12 years ago with a lovely gentleman there, a wonderful researcher of ancient mysteries in his own right called Gary Cook, which I'm friends with to this very day. He's got a beard that looks as big as Gandalf's, and I envy him totally. And he took me to see this anomalous wall, which I knew nothing about. And it looks just like something that you would have built on Easter Island or any of the Ahu platforms on the islands of Polynesia, or even in South America. In fact, if you would take me blindfold from South America or Cusco all the way to New Zealand, I would have said these are kind of similar people. It hasn't stood the test of time. There are several sections here which are above the ground, and it's made of a much more porous rock. So obviously it's come under the influence of weather for the last 10,000 years. But they took me to another little section that they've been slowly digging up quietly, because you're not allowed to dig around this because the Maori never built with stone, they said. And they said, no, we never used stone. But once it was found that this was a structure of some importance, suddenly the Maori claimed it. And when they claim it, it means that the white people can't go digging things up. So you have to go there and do this surreptitiously. And they took me around the back of this wall, and they took out these bushes, and lo and behold, there's a big hole. It's about 6 foot deep, and they've taken out most of the ash, and the stone is in perfect condition, exactly as you'd find in South America. And they said, jump in there and tell us what you think. So I jumped into this hole, this beautifully flat surface as though it's been machined, and I jump onto it, and it makes a lovely boom sound under it. And I said, that tells me that there's an echo under this stone.
Yeah, there's more. Right.
There is a room under this stone. Why can't we dig this up? And I said, well, let us tell you about the story of what's going on in New Zealand. It's not much fun. So, yes, there is this one anomalous structure. And there are, I think, Martin Dupre as well. He's also another researcher in New Zealand. He's been trying to also piece together the remnants of another stone culture that was down there. But it's very hard to come across, again, mostly because of the volcanic activity of New Zealand, which really doesn't allow for any structures to be found nowadays. And a lot of them are still buried in deep forests. What I can say is that the Maori in the 19th century were still describing interacting with 12-foot tall red-haired giants that were now living on some of the hills on the North Island. And often, and even in the 1950s, there is a case of one of these giants who was actually found washed up on the shores of the North Island near the town of Raglan, where there was a hill which was literally called the Hill of the Red-Haired Giants. So as far as the 19th century, these giant people were still there, and they were supposed to be the offspring of these gods that escaped the flood 11,000 years ago.
We've got so much information flying from different directions here. I'm trying to
it's mind-boggling.
It is. And I want to go back to the Amara really quick. How old is their civilization?
I'm sorry, which one?
The Amara.
Oh, the Aymara. It's my good friend Edgar was saying that we can definitely trace our history back to the flood. We remember we still describe in our schools. Think about this for a second. We still describe in school the time when we escaped a global catastrophe, a massive inundation of the world, and we ended up in around Lake Titicaca on high ground for very good reason. But he said there is a culture that's even older than ours. There's even fewer of them remaining. There's only about 9,000 people remaining, and they're called the Pukina. And they apparently were the people who were also assisting the gods in building the temple cities around Lake Titicaca. And that was a huge revelation. But there is something very unusual about the Aymara, because it's not just a fact that it's a name of a people, it's also a language. In fact, the two are synonymous with each other. And it's very interesting that I came across an account by a computer expert that was actually looking into Aymara, and the fact that it looks like it developed not as a language, as languages do organically. They seem to have actually created Aymara from scratch. And he said that, excuse me, it's a bit dry here. The syntax of Aymara is very rigidly structured, and it's unambiguous, and it's seemingly developed from scratch, unlike a typical language which develops organically. Mm-hmm. And he said that Aymara can also be written in algebraic shorthand that a computer can understand. It's a kind of bridge language, an algorithm with the ability to translate from one language to another, whereby the language of a document can be translated into Aymara and then into any number of languages. Now, that absolutely blew my mind when I heard about this.
What are we suggesting? That's pretty bold.
It's very bold, and it comes from a computer expert that was looking at the syntax of the language, and he said, "No, this did not just develop organically like language usually does, like English, for example. It takes time to develop. This thing just appears out of nowhere, completely constructed, unambiguous, and it's almost like a bridge language between other languages. Now, for that to happen, you have to have a civilization point, which is already tens of thousands of years old, to be able to develop that kind of ability. So we are definitely talking about an echo of a very, very early culture.
I need to take a break right here, and I don't want to stop. I want to ask you a general question here. The ancient gods of Egypt, which ended up morphing into Greek culture, and of course the Roman culture, and Horus and Thoth, we know about that. Did we have the same type of morphing going through with the Egyptian gods through South America and through Easter Island?
There was no morphing at all. This is the reason why I really wanted to put this project together, because I always thought, as you just said, that these are all separate people, and some of them morphed into other languages, some were borrowed, some were stolen.
Right.
But the more I began to inquire into these old cultures and actually asking them directly about these stories, the more it became quite obvious that we're talking about one brotherhood, because their names all overlap around the world, and that was what we've been missing, and that's what I was gluing together. The fact that their names don't only just overlap, but their titles of office also overlap. And at that moment, you suddenly just basically connected every single dot in all of these people, from the Dogon to the Yucatan, to Iberia, to South America, to the Polynesia, India, China, all the way through the Middle East and back to Egypt. It turns out they were one and the same brotherhood, but it was a big brotherhood and sisterhood, of course, because there was women involved. In fact, the one woman involved with each one of these groups was the wisdom keeper. But that was the big aha, that we've been treating them as different people, whereas the ancients and then the indigenous people said, no, they were all connected by a global culture. It's just the fact that they're called by different things in different areas that's been very confusing. But when you look at the descriptions of them, they're always unanimous. Very tall, much taller than humans, usually about 8.5 to 9.5 feet tall, red-headed, light-skinned, blue or green eyes, sometimes blonde, and that elongated head as well. So that's what really connected them all together.
Yeah, and it seems that we have 60 seconds, but it seems that we find not only hieroglyphics, but representation of not only Egypt, but the Anunnaki, or Sumerian culture too as well, reaching around globally, but the historians don't want to admit this fact. That's where we get stonewalled.
Absolutely. And in fact, if you look at the Egyptian language, it's all over Polynesia. For example, there's one island in the Solomon Islands where the giants are still alive and well. If you talk to the villagers, they're frightened of them. They're about 15 feet tall there. But they said, they don't pose any harm to anybody. They want to be left alone. And we do. And the name of the island is called Isa Yatea. and it literally means the white-skinned people of Ra. Now, how did that end up in the Solomon Islands?
Might as well just say the white-skinned people of Giza, right?
Exactly.
Amazing. Let's take our break right here, Freddie. We'll be right back, and we will continue this conversation. We're talking about Freddie's new book, The Missing Lands. This is Fade to Black. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. More with Freddie after this short break. Stay with us. Welcome back, Fade to Black. Our guest tonight, Freddy Silva. We're talking about his new book. It's called The Missing Lands, and it's very simple to go and check out. Go to his website. It is theinvisibletemple.com. The links are over at jimmychurchradio.com. Now, Freddie, I want to go into a different direction. Well, sort of, because everything is connected. It doesn't matter.
Oh, absolutely.
But we all know about Kukulkan, Quetzalcoatl. We know these names, but there is another god in Central and South America. It's Zamna. Can you tell us about that?
And hardly anyone ever talks about poor old Itzamna. He's the most important one of them all. You know what the funny thing is? Again, asking the local people, finding out from their point of view, it turns out all these names are not names at all. They're titles, which is very confusing because there are many Quetzalcoatl, and it drives historians crazy because they'll say, oh, Quetzalcoatl is only about 2,000 years old. And the Guatemalans will say, well, there's been about 15 or 20 of them because it's a title. It's something that you aspire to be. You aspire to be a Quetzalcoatl or a Kukulkan. But Itzamna is the full crux of the story, because when you talk to the Maya shaman, and they have a lot of information up in the jungles of Guatemala, because that's essentially where they ran to when the Spanish arrived. And a lot of it, again, is not been written for good reason. They want to make sure that the information is maintained orally. There is a tradition. And you have to make an effort to find out where it is, unlike the Spanish, who just basically boiled people and got the information out of them. But they only got the cliff notes, so to speak. They got the tourist version of the story. The juicier parts were kept to themselves. Now, Itzamna was essentially a kind of god-man. He was, again, the charismatic leader of a group of 7 craftspeople who, about 11,000 years ago, mysteriously land on the shores of Yucatan, around about the same time that the Egyptians were telling the story of a landmass somewhere in the Atlantic that we know very well. We'll come back to that one in a second. So in 9600 BC, it is stated in the Chilam Balam and in the oral tradition of Guatemala that Itzamna shows up on the shores after a massive global flood, and they were there to rebuild the former mansions of the gods. And there were 3 different vessels. He was captain of one of them. There was another one called Quetzalcoatl, who was also there with 7 other shining people. And Kukulkan also had 7 shining people with them. And the thing that connected all 3 of them as a badger's office was that they're all called the People of the Serpent. And it literally is a title. It's essentially when you work with the symbol of the serpent, you are a master of earth energy. You know how to understand nature. You can bend it to your will. That's what the phrase means. It has absolutely nothing to do with reptilians. I'm sorry about that. It's going to upset a lot of people. But it's not an opinion. It's a fact from Central America. So Itzamna, they said that he basically came from this island continent in the middle of the Atlantic called Atoll. They're into very short names back then. The Aztec eventually extended that name to call it Atitlan, and we all know what the rest of the story goes. So their charge with Itzamna and his craftsmen was to go around rebuilding an image of where they had come from. And they started at Chichen Itza, which is where the name, of course, comes from. There's the Itz in the title. And it literally means priest magician. And they settled around Chichen Itza, and then they moved inland over the course of 1,000 years, building places like Palenque, Tikal, and so forth. But not the places that we see today, because what we see today is the exterior shape of the onion, because these pyramids, these temples have been built and rebuilt and rebuilt and rebuilt. So they started off fairly small, and then they became the mass that they are today. That's, again, where historians get tripped up. They'll say, yes, this thing has only been built for 800 years ago, and they'll be absolutely right. But you have to go to the core of the pyramid of the magician. You have to go to the core of the pyramid of Kukulkan to find out the true age, and that's where you're talking about thousands and thousands of years. So essentially, they eventually ended up at the highlands of Guatemala. They landed in a big lake, which looked like an inland ocean, called Lake Atitlan. This is where the name comes from. And just to show that all habits don't die hard, they basically went to an island in the middle of this massive lake, and they built an image of their original temple back in Atitlan. And you have to wonder where the logic of these people comes from, because if you think about it, and of course Atlantis, of course, is where the Azores is today, a highly volatile volcanic region, and these magician priests end up settling in the highlands of Guatemala, in an island in the middle of a lake, surrounded by very active volcanoes. Well, you know what's going to happen next. When those volcanoes blew up, their island home sank yet again. So it's a bit of a strange joke that these people were trying to get away from calamity, and they found it again. So they rebuilt on the shore this time, and part of the city is still there. But if there's one place that still survives, it's actually on Lake Petén Itzá, which is a bit closer to the Yucatan. And the island is called the island of Flores. There's a lovely town there, and there's no trace of the original temple city there, because the Spanish literally took down every stone, including a 9-tiered pyramid, and they built the town from the stones of the entire temple. So you can see how big it was. It takes you about 30 minutes to walk by foot from one side of the island to the other. So that's a lot of stone that they moved. But that's essentially where they survived. And the church on top of the island at Flores, it's misaligned. Christian churches tend to be aligned exactly east to face the equinox because it's a symbol of Christ's resurrection. Right. And the church on top of the island of Flores is actually highly misaligned to about 134 degrees south. And I figured, well, if they came from Europe and they built a church on something, they would have tried to hide what was there originally. And this is why the church is not facing east. Well, the funny thing is, by putting that church in that alignment, it allows me to basically take a bead from that hilltop and find out what was there originally and what it was looking at. And what it was looking at was the sunrise on the winter solstice in about 7,600 BC. So within 2,000 years of landing in the Yucatan, Itzamna and his godmen and women had managed to basically create an entire temple culture, something like 30,000 temples that they built over the course of thousands of years, and we're still discovering them today. So
this
it's
is
a wonderful story.
This is a treasure. This is a treasure hunt.
It's an incredible treasure hunt, and you got to be patient. You've got to listen to what the local people are saying, and more importantly, you've got to listen to the language and the meaning of words, because, again, so much of our information comes from translations. For example, Toph, there's no such thing as Toph. That's a Greek transliteration of the godman of Egypt called Jehuti, or Tehote, or Tot. That's the original pronunciation. But because language has to evolve, and it also has to evolve from culture to culture, some cultures can't pronounce things properly, so they begin to adapt the names. Osiris is another classic example. That's not his real name. The real name is Wasar, where we get the word vizier from. So Osiris, Wasar, was actually the vizier, and they all claim to be real physical people, not just imaginary gods.
With Itzamna and talking about the big A, right? Let's not beat around the bush. We're talking about Atlantis here.
Oh, even Robert Schoch has mentioned that on there.
Yeah, Robert Schoch. This is many years ago, but I'm hosting a panel. He's on it. So is Graham Hancock. So is Robert Bivol, right? I've got the big three right there. And
never heard of them.
Yeah, and Robert goes, Jimmy, you're not going to get me to talk about the big A. I said, what, aliens? And he goes, that's the thing in education, in academia, you can go out and step outside of the box. But once you mention Atlantis, you're through. And we just don't do it. We can't do it.
Absolutely.
And I just think it's funny to me. I really do. It's
because academics don't understand the mechanism called myth. Again, as I said earlier, it's a theatrical device by which people were able to write an incredible story that encapsulates a certain truth. You have to separate the truth from the story, and there's your truth. And that's what enabled people like Plato to convey incredible stories that we still remember today. I mean, for example, Jason and the Argonauts. It's a quest of the initiate searching for his divine bride, and it basically was written in a way that wouldn't betray the experience of the person that originally wrote it. Eventually, it becomes a story of Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, disguised for a completely different audience. But that's what they can't get over. They don't understand that simple thing. All they have to do is look at the facts. And the Yucatan, if they're saying that Itzamna shows up in 9,600 BC, well, it's funny that the priests in Egypt who were talking to Solon, from whom Plato got the story from, they were telling Solon that the final sinking of Atlantis was actually in 9,600 BC. So this is where you have to tell the academics. Now, can you explain to me, if these people who were supposed to be hunter-gatherers 11,000 years ago, if they weren't communicating to each other, how is it that in the Yucatan, which is, I'm going to take a wild guess here, 5,000 miles from Egypt, how were they able to come up with exactly the same story of the same continent by virtually the same name, and also at the same date for its sinking? Something is amiss here, and that's how I usually present the story, because I let them think about it. Because now you basically have to undermine your own story, that you're saying, well, these people were barbarians, they didn't talk to each other, they didn't get around very much. Okay, well, explain to me how they have the same story, the same date, and the same underlying mechanism. And then, of course, they just start telling you that you're an idiot or a pyramid, and the conversation's over. So, yeah, the theory doesn't hold water from that point of view, because the stories all line up.
Yeah, are you saying that Itzamna and the myth behind him and his origin story at 9600 BC appearing from an island that just blew up, by the way, is the same origin story that is in the builder's text in Egypt that goes back and dates at 9600 BC. Again, the exploding of an island, and that's where the gods of Egypt arrived. It's the same. Much. Yeah, is that what we're saying here?
Pretty much. And what happened was that the building texts were rediscovered by the Greeks when they were helping to rebuild the temples along the Nile. Because remember, Egypt was destroyed by the Syrians and earthquakes, of course.
That's right.
And the Greeks were very smart. They said, my God, what have we got here? And they were running against time, because they said that the world's getting more and more stupid by the day. Even back then, they were saying this. And they said, forget the oral tradition and the fact that the information has to stay in the temple. We're just going to carve the damn thing on the walls as quickly as possible. And what you see today on the walls of Edfu, which is the building text, are a fraction of the story. The rest of it comes up in the stories of Alexandria and also at Heliopolis in Egypt, which is now no more. It's just one obelisk. And they appear in Arabic texts, but they begin to overlap. Now, in the building text, they actually don't mention Atlantis by name, or it being anywhere near towards the west. They talk about the way they give the coordinates is that they seem to have arrived from the east, somewhere down the Red Sea, back when it was actually a big ocean that went inland as far as Ethiopia. And they said that there was an island where the gods came from called Iutiti. And I'm thinking, hello, I've come across this name before. It literally means the island Titi, which is where the Urukeu of New Zealand and Easter Islands named the location for Tiwanaku. So there's an overlap here, but there was something else that wasn't quite adding up for me. I think they had two things that were part of the story was missing. And it was my great fortune to have come across the last surviving wisdom keeper in the island of Tongareva. You'll have to Google this because you will not find Tongareva on the map. It's the furthest outlying rock in the Cook Islands group in the middle of Polynesia. And I don't know how I managed to have this guy contact me or how we got together by magic. I spoke to him on the phone. It was the most expensive phone call of my life. It was worth every penny because he was saying, well, we have a flood tradition in the Cook Islands, and we originally came from the Middle East. And after a big rise in sea level, there was major goings on. There were people that moved here who were quite tall, light-skinned, red-headed, and you call them gods. We just call them very smart people, which I thought was a very funny way of handling it. And they come from a very old tradition, and we call them Tupanaki. And I said, that sounds very much like people I know called Anunnaki. I said, yeah, you call them the Anunnaki. And I thought, wait a minute. Are we talking about the big flood here? I said, oh, no, this is about 3000 BC. And I said, well, that's not the period I'm looking at. I mean, I am familiar with the fact that in 3000 BC, there was another major catastrophe and sea levels rose by 25 feet and there was major displacement. That's not what I'm concerned with. And then he says, oh, but we have an even older flood myth, which is the big one. I said, well, that's more like it. Well, what can you tell me about that? Well, the Tupanaki or the Anunnaki actually used to make constant voyages from the Middle East all the way to the Cook Islands to areas which, of course, now underwater. Because why would you come all the way from the Middle East to go to a tiny island in the middle of Polynesia? It doesn't make any sense.
What island was it in the Cook Islands?
Tongareva. It's about 19. I think it's about 19 miles long by about 3 miles wide. It's about 10 feet above sea level. And basically, he was saying, yeah, this is where they came from originally. The Anunnaki, who are also called by the name Anunnaki in India, who basically they are the people of the serpent. That's what it means. And they used to live on a circular island in the Indian Ocean. And I thought, great, finally I've got the centerpiece to my book. And he says, well, you won't find it. I said, why? Well, think about it for a second. Sea level has risen 140 feet after the flood. I said, yes. You have a lot of geological movement. You have sedimentation. And Robert Schock and I were talking about this as well. And he agreed. He said, there's no way we can even begin to understand the map of the world before the rise in sea level. I mean, a lot has happened since then. And he's absolutely right, of course. And I said, well, where do you think in your traditions was the homeland of the Anunnaki? Because no one's ever really been able to quite place it. We keep saying it's somewhere near Göbekli Tepe, it's somewhere in the Caucasus region, somewhere around Dubai. All of these are all looked at, and I've taken a look at all of these stories. But he said, no, the prime area was an island in the middle of the ocean, and it sank in the last conflagration at the end of the Ice Age. And another piece of land rose in its stead. You know it by the name of the Arabian Peninsula. And I nearly dropped 5 kilos of weight when I heard this. So somewhere in the region where there's now this vast desert of Saudi Arabia is kind of the region where this lost island of the Anunnaki used to be. And that comes straight from the mouth of the last surviving wisdom keeper of Tongareva. And I'm glad I was able to put this in print because I don't know how much longer he's going to be alive.
Okay, what can we date? Can we date when this island was there? Certainly, Saudi Arabia was lush and possibly even, covered in water at one point, but it must have been a very long time ago. Do you have any kind of dating on this?
Oh God, they never ever date anything because it all goes by the stars. They said that back then the stars were in a completely different position in the sky. So we're talking thousands of years, but certainly it precedes the last great rise in sea level, which is in 3000 BC, that is certain. That's when most of the Persian Gulf actually flooded. But you also have to understand that in the traditions of the world traditions of the catastrophes, and certainly the 3 ice ages or the 3 driest periods, that things happened. There were 3 catastrophes essentially, and things didn't go down in one go. People tend to think that Atlantis went down in one night. Well, actually, it went down in 3 different movements. And the same thing happened to Arabia, and he was quite clear about that too. It went down gradually over the 3,000 years. So parts of Saudi Arabia began to be desertified. Back then, there was no Persian Gulf. And of course, parts of it rose and parts fell. And somewhere in there is an island that was by itself, a circular island where they used to live. And that kind of ties in also with the story of the Egyptians in the building texts, that it was somewhere in the Indian Ocean, not far from today's Arabian Peninsula, but not as far as, say, for example, the Maldives or Sri Lanka. There was something else there. And there was an incredible story that I came across called The Story of the Shipwrecked Sailor. It's in the Leningrad Museum, if I'm not mistaken. It's a weird story. There's no date on it. And it talks about how this sailor goes on a boat to the Red Sea and then out into the open ocean to the Indian Ocean. And the ship is overwhelmed by a storm. He is all hands are lost. He's the only survivor, of course, because someone had to tell the tale. And he ends up in a deserted island, or so he thinks. A few days go by, and he meets the leader of the island, who basically says, listen, we're giving you a ship and some food and a bottle of wine. Lucky bugger. And we're going to send you back to Egypt because next time you come this way, this island will be no more. It will be consumed by a catastrophe. We're making preparations to leave. And I thought, I wonder what they could be talking about. And the sailor, the shipwrecked sailor, ends up describing the leader of this island as a serpent with blue eyes. And I went, holy mother, this is absolutely what we're talking about here, because serpents don't have blue eyes. It is literally describing one of the serpent people who happened to be the badge of office of the Anunnaki, just like they're called the serpent people in the Yucatan,
right.
Just like they're called the Nagi or the Naga people throughout Polynesia, China, and also Japan and India. So it's I'm reading slightly into it, but the story is telling me a lot of information. For example, the serpent also had a beard. That does not sound to me like an animal. That sounds to me like a person. And what he was trying to say is that he was one of the people of the serpent. That's why it was written in that particular format. So, yeah, we're sort of talking somewhere around that Arabian Peninsula. There was quite likely the original home of the Anunnaki. And there were archaeological investigations that were done in the 1900s that posited that somewhere around Bahrain, possibly Dubai, there was the remains of a antediluvial culture. And they said that they were surprised to find this there. There are some monuments that exist there which look exactly like some of the towers in Peru. And I mean, if you were taken an Andean person to Abu Dhabi and look at one of these towers, he would have sworn he would be back home. And the way that the megalithic stonework is done without any mortar and those beautiful shaped stones that fit perfectly together, it's all there. That shouldn't be there. And the archaeologists were also saying, we wait to see whether we can find more of this civilization under the Persian Gulf, because obviously the waters have risen. There must be the remains of the biggest civilization here. So we're beginning to home in on all of this circumstantial evidence and beginning to home in on an area where the original Anunnaki used to live.
Now, because of the size of Saudi Arabia, obviously to the north and its proximity to Mesopotamia and ancient Iraq, that would seem obvious. But if it was in the southern part of Saudi Arabia or on the western, near Mecca and the Red Sea, now that we're talking a great distance from ancient Sumer and Mesopotamia, aren't we?
Not so much. We're talking maybe about 500 miles. Not that far at all. It was certainly doable for people who obviously were getting around the Pacific and the Indian as easily as you and I go shopping for groceries or guitar strings, for that matter.
Sure.
They literally were a very able seafaring people. They were master astronomers and navigators. So I wouldn't put it past them to be able to cross the ocean 1,000 miles and still know where they're going. So I don't think that would be a concern. The only major concern is trying to find the clues as to what the place would be. Because if you look at the original Book of Enoch, it does describe a very mountainous region. And the only place I can think of is the absolute northeastern quadrant of Saudi Arabia, where there are some quite tall mountains there, and that section is actually still slipping into the ocean, which would have been definitely a place that would have been volatile even just by itself without the addition of meteorites or a rising sea level. And there is a town there of which I can get no information from. The people in that part of the region, they're very touchy about discussing anything before Muhammad, and I have to respect that. But there is one town there which sounds remarkably like the name of the town that is given in the original Book of Enoch, which is Garsag, and the name is still spelt with a K to this very day. All I know is that the Portuguese settled there in the 14th century and set up some big fort using stones of a very large size from an old structure that used to be there. That's the only information that's available. So we'll wait to see what happens.
Now, if we go with Sitchin and some of the traditional text of the Anunnaki, they were chasing gold. They were mining gold. Is there gold in Saudi Arabia?
I don't know. What I do know is, and this is a fact, this is not also a personal opinion, I really like Sitchin a lot. He opened my eyes when I was a youngster. I remember reading his first book, and it really blew me apart. But his big sort of claim to fame was the fact that he could read Sumerian, and back then no one could do that. He seems to be the only person in the world that was able to use this. But since then, a lot of people have become very versed in that ancient language, and they said, actually, when you read a lot of Sitchin's work, he's making a lot of the words fit a theory. And so you've got to tread carefully with Sitchin. So I kind of tend to go more with the positive angle because you get to hear so much about the version of the Anunnaki being manipulators of humans, being very dark, nasty people. But then again, dark cells. I was reading as much of the original story as I can get my hands on, and it turns out that these people are actually quite benevolent. But again, they had the same problems we have as humans. They also had issues, and there were people who also were doing some very stupid things, but they were the minority. And to put this into context, the lords of Anu, who were essentially the bigwigs, they had a group of craftsmen around them called Watchers, and they are also called Shining Ones. That was because they had to keep anointing themselves with this oil. They seemed to have a problem with their skin and the sun. The two just didn't go together very well. And the writer upon whose story Enoch is based, it's actually borrowed from a Sumerian story, which is borrowed from a Mesopotamian story. The writer was saying, they used to put some oil on their skin because they were very white skins, and they seemed to have a trouble with adapting to the sunlight. That's why they nicknamed them the Shining Ones. But it was also a nickname to describe their high intellect. Now,
let me jump in right there, Freddie. I got to take a break, and we'll pick up right here when we come back. Anunnaki Benevolent. I've got it right here in my notes. The Shining Ones will start when we come back. This is Fade to Black. Our guest, Freddy Silva. Stay with us. Welcome back, Fade to Black. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. Our guest tonight, Freddy Silva. We're talking about his new book, The Missing Lands. It's a great read. Go and get your own copy. Click on Freddy's link right there at jimmychurchradio.com, invisibletemple.com. And Freddie, look, right now I'm going to share the collective thought of this audience, which is, hold on a minute.
Hit me.
Hold on a minute. The Anunnaki Benevolent, they created us as a slave race to dig up their gold. They altered our DNA. Then they split and abandoned us. There was nothing benevolent about them. What is Freddie on about here?
What is he smoking? I went back to the earliest text I could possibly find, and once you start taking take a deep breath and just sort of forget what you've read for the last 40 or 50 years. And something about the story that Sitchin was portraying didn't sit well with me. I don't know why. And I wanted to go back to the beginning. So reading the story, it turns out that there was a group of people here called the Lords of Anu, and they lived somewhere very high up. And they had a group of work people around them called the Watchers. They were like go-betweens between them and the human race. And there was a mandate. There was a mandate that they should not really interfere in the affairs of humans. They were there to guide and counsel and slowly disseminate information to humans to help them how to domesticate crop and domesticate cattle and slowly develop the accoutrements of civilization. Basically, there was a group of people, a small group of watchers who decided, you know what, Earth girls are really cute. I think we should go down and disobey orders and hang out and mate with them. And the Anu were very explicit about this. They said, this is not going to work well. We should not be interfering in the development of these people. We are only here to assist, and the rest of the story is missing, unfortunately. But for whatever reason that we don't know, there was a group of these technicians, these craftspeople, who decided to just leave their premises and go and hang out with humans and mate with women, and the results were terrible. And this is probably where the story of Sitchin kind of starts picking up and where everybody ran off with the story, forgetting that there was another side to the story. And it turns out that they were doing stupid experiments, starting with the fact that their DNA and human DNA didn't quite mix too well. And if you ask the Wichita native people of Kansas and Oklahoma, they will say that, yes, back in the days before the flood, there were giant people here, and they interbred with our wives, and the wives gave birth to infants, and hardly any of them survived giving childbirth. For obvious reasons. At this point, this is where some of the watchers, the fallen watchers, began to experiment with DNA. And after that, there were some really bad problems because the next offspring were the Nephilim, which, by the way, is an Aramaic name which means Orion, by which all of these people are associated with, by the way, all around the world. But that's another story. It was their offspring that created terrible problems. They went around butchering people. They were cannibals. They were doing some awful things, including teaching humans the art of warfare, metallurgy, a lot of stuff that hunter-gatherers shouldn't know without obviously steps in development. That's the kind of story that we end up hearing about all the time, and it's such a shame because when you look at back at the original text, and the Lords of Anu were shaking their heads saying, we have lost control of this. This is out of control. And they're asking the watchers who are still loyal to the Anu to say, you need to bring these renegades in and put them in jail and kill them. Just put them in deep pits, put them in magma, and just get rid of them because they have really offended the Lords of Creation. We can't have this. And humans are suffering, and they're not going to make it because the children of the watchers, the Nephilim, taking over the world. We can't have this. And the Watchers were trying to do the best they could to bring in the renegades. But you can tell from the story that they were just, they were not going to make it. They were up against the sheer numbers of the exercise that they had to go through. They were not going to succeed. And the Lords of Anu basically got together and said, we're just going to have to wipe out the Earth. We have no choice. And you can read this bittersweetness in the story where they're literally, there's fragments of the story missing, but if you keep your eye on the ball, it's quite clear that they knew very well what the Earth was doing and what it does twice a year, which is twice a year, and we still do this today, the Earth travels through a big field of debris called the Taurid meteor stream. And they knew that every year the Earth would be dancing with death around November, which is why we celebrate the Day of the Dead in the North and the South Hemisphere at the same time. We shouldn't be doing that. In the Southern Hemisphere, we should be celebrating the Day of the Dead in May. But anyway, from reading the story, some of the Lords of Anu said there are things that even we haven't taught the Watchers, and that we're able to manipulate the laws of nature at will. And putting that into the scheme of what they're saying, it seems to me that they were able to use their willpower or the power of their intent, which we know today is an incredible thing when you put several people together with focused intent. And there are experiments which have been done at Princeton which prove that even 20 people sitting around a computer can alter a drum beat with your mind. This is a peer-reviewed experiment. So if we can do that as humans, I'm sure they were even better than us. And it seems to me that they were able to guide big fragments of rock through which we were passing anyway as a planet. They were able to guide big rocks which fell into the right places at the right time and created a monstrous flood. And you read the story and you look at the aftermath, and you can hear the bittersweetness in the whole thing. They said, we had no choice. We had to start from scratch. The humans would not have a chance at survival. And if you look back on this in perspective, had the Lords of Anu not interfered in the flood and manipulated the comets to hit, we today, as a human race, would not exist. We would be a planet of very tall, red-haired people, basically a bunch of cannibals killing each other. So that's basically the story, and I urge anyone to really go back to the original text and reread the story, because there are two sides to the coin here. But again, that much is said is true for Sitchin, that he is right. There were two kinds of people, and just like humans, they also had problems. I mean, there were, even in the Greek stories, we talk about the wars of the gods. They didn't always agree with each other. I mean, Enlil, for example, he didn't give a damn about humans. He was one of the Anu. Enki, on the other hand, was very benevolent. He was totally into saving humanity and figuring out how can we get around this big obstacle. And you can see him trying desperately to avoid this situation to no avail. So part of the story is true. Part of Sitchin's angle is correct. But you really need to put the big story in perspective and go back to the original. The story is much more interesting, because whenever you locate the watchers around the world, you find that the indigenous people have nothing but good things to say about them. I've not come across one thing that is negative, starting with the Hopi. Now, if you ask the story of the Hopi or the Zuni, and Clifford Mahuti will back me up on this, lovely man, he said, when I said one day, I want to go to Horseshoe Canyon in Utah and look at the big panel, the ghost panel, which is a terrible name. And he had these beautiful petroglyphs of 8-foot-tall people dressed in this beautiful gossamer. And I said to him, they look very familiar. I think I've seen these people before. And he said, oh, you've come across them before. You'll know who they are. We call them lookers in our culture. And I thought about this for a second. I said, are you saying that the people who are shown in the canyons and the petroglyphs with those, enormous silhouette shapes are the watchers? He said, yes. They're the ones who basically helped us escape the flood from the Pacific. They helped the Anasazi also come to North America. And they were benevolent teachers. We're still in touch with them today in spirit form. Sometimes they appear in physical form. They come here in their flying shields, as they call them. So I have not heard one negative thing about all of these watchers and Anu wherever I've gone around the world. It's strange that. So there are two sides to this story, and I really do urge people to sort of see the bigger picture here.
What about it? It sounds like, okay, what about Nibiru and how Enlil and, the crew got here? What about the Mars connection and the great battles that were going on too as well, and the interfamily rivalry from this extraterrestrial race? That part of Sitchin's translations, were those accurate?
I think they were fairly accurate, yes. I can't remember what time period he puts them in, but I had the fortune to also work with some very bright people in England when I was writing my first book on crop circles. And I should point out that the original crop circles were also made by the Watchers, if anybody's interested, which is an extraordinary story, which goes, but we'll sort of not get digressed, because it really is a huge story.
Sure.
And the people who, my original editor, had worked on the Mars missions with Percy and Myers, and they wrote a book called 2/3, A History of Our Galaxy. I don't recommend it because it will fry your brain. I mean, really, it will fry your brain unless you're a mathematician. I urge you to borrow it from the library and then take it easy, because it's over 900 pages long. It has pictures, but that describes a time millions of years ago when, yes, there were people on the Cydonia region, and to cut a very long story short, when their weather went ballistic, like ours is going right now, we're essentially reliving history. They formed a group to basically move to Earth when it was still fairly inhabitable, and restart a part of civilization based on what they had back in the Cydonia region. Now, one of the main focal points of the book, 2/3, is that they showed the Mars region of Cydonia and mapped it, and they were able to find the information that said that they had landed in southern England, and they rebuilt the entire thing there in a smaller scale version. And when you take the monuments in Cydonia and place them over the main monuments around Stonehenge, or I should say where the latter-day version of Stonehenge is, because Stonehenge was built between 8,000, 3,000, and 2,500 BC. It's been built in stages.
Right.
But before that, there was something else there as well. If you put if you scale down Cydonia over southern Britain, you hit all the major monuments like Stonehenge, Avebury, and so forth. And I find that story rather compelling from that point of view. It's very mathematically precise, and mathematics is either right or wrong. So from that point of view, I would agree with Sitchin's point of view, and I would say that, yes, there were arguments between the gods. They were no different to us. They had their mind of their own, and they never always agreed. But it's just sad that it's always the negative side of the story that gets so much attention. And by the way, I'm not being paid by the Anunnaki to do a positive PR on them.
Yeah, you're a good spokesman.
I'm trying to rehabilitate him, because I think that all things being equal, there's always a different side to the story. And when I was reading it, I was really moved when I could hear the pain that was going on watching the Earth being destroyed. And they said, we just had no choice. Humans were not going to survive. Because when you think about this for a second, Jimmy, when the flood waters recede, you had these groups of gods who basically appear in strategic places around the world to rebuild the former mansions of the gods. And exactly at that moment, humans discover agriculture, animal husbandry, and all the equipments of civilization. They gave us civilization. It was thanks to them that we are where we are today. You might not agree with where things have happened, but it's free will. But if it wasn't for them helping us back on our feet, we wouldn't be here today. So they can't be that bad people if they give us that much.
I actually do want to do crop circles for just a second, and we're running out of time. And so it's been an amazing crop circle season this year. And one of the points for crop circles for me is that nobody's been caught. In that, I'm talking about how the skeptics are always going to say it's people out there creating them. I don't know who they think they could possibly be when we're talking about artwork and math and the physics and science side of it that comes into play in their design and the way that they look. But all of that aside, nobody's been caught, Freddie. Nobody's been caught making a crop circle over all of these many decades. And this season has been just as incredible, if not more incredible than previous years. What do you think is going on?
If you're a total believer in crop circles, I suggest that you might want to switch off now, because what I'm about to tell you is not going to be happy. But this is the truth. Back in 2002, when my book on crop circles was published, and it becomes an international bestseller, which is amazing. I had no idea. Almost as though it was all planned. I didn't even want to write a book about this, for heaven's sake. I almost got pushed into it. A friend of mine said to me very prophetically that the book is so well-rounded from so many angles that the moment it gets published, the hoaxing is going to get a lot better. And he was absolutely right. And after 2003, the phenomenon began to die out very quickly, and the hoaxing got better and better and better. They still can't replicate the original features. They can't replicate the electromagnetism, the lack of breakage to the plants, the genetic manipulation of the plants, the changes to the soil structure, everything. All of that stuff is very validatable. But since 2003, I would say maybe 1% of crop circles are probably genuine. I've caught people making crop circles all the time when I lived in England. I caught a group which was 14 people strong. They've made some pretty elaborate things because they're getting away with it because they know the fields where they can actually work without being seen in daylight, because they know how it works. They know the fields. They've paid the farmers off because the farmers are fed up with the amount of attention that they're getting and all the nonsense that comes from the mainstream media about it's being hoaxing. So they believe it's a hoax. But you talk to the ones in Canada, for example, and they've had the most extraordinary experiences, and they'll say, no, we've had extraordinary experiences and we've seen unbelievable things. We know it's a real phenomenon. And of course, they're not subjected to the mass tourism as they do in south of England. So when you have hoaxes that work in groups of 14, very well-organized people using laser devices, and I found them because they keep dropping them. They basically work with impunity from the law. And there were people who actually were caught, and they were prosecuted, by the way. You can achieve quite a lot. And a lot of the stuff that I find today, they're basically copies of very old stuff that they keep regurgitating, and some of them are very good copies of original crop circles as well. So it's really muddied the waters, and it really pains me to have to say this because I know it means so much to so many people, but at the same time, I didn't give up everything, including my marriage, my house, my income, to lie about this phenomenon. I want to tell the truth, and the truth is there is a real phenomenon. But if you really want to find it, you will find it in the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s. And it's full of great information. It is here to change humanity again. It's empowering people. For example, the image on the cover of my book, I put that there deliberately because I know what it does. And this all came from channeled materials from a woman in England who was channeling the source of the crop circles before the crop circles began to appear. And in a way, the book was kind of validating what she was saying, but I backed it up with the science to go with it, which is a wonderful moment in time for me because she's a good friend of mine, or became a good friend of mine. And that particular design, which is called the Barbary Castle Tetrahedron of 1991, we were told many decades ago that there would be an energy device that would be imprinted into the fields, in the grain, by this group of people called Watchers. And they said that it would help revolutionize propulsion in the world. We'll be giving up our need to destroy the world with fossil fuels, which, of course, is wonderful. And they said it will be done indirectly by someone writing the information, and the information will go into the heads of scientists. The scientists won't know where the information is coming from. They think they're inventing this, but we'll put the idea into their heads. So far, I have met 3 groups of scientists, one in London, one in Oklahoma, of all places, and one in Australia, and they said that they have built a 3-dimensional model of that image, and it defies gravity, exactly as it mentioned in the actual channeling. And they're waiting for the right political moment to bring this out because, as you know, Jimmy, even people who design cars that run on water suddenly are run over by their own cars. So again, it tracks very nicely with this sense that the Watchers have always been out there looking out for us at a time when we are faced with ecological disaster. I mean, we really are right on the wire here. And I find it rather interesting that all of these designs in the fields are full of this kind of information. There are healing modalities, for example. There's new mathematics. But you have to go back to the original phenomenon when most of the formations were real between the 70s and the 90s. After that, you're in very dodgy territory. They're great to look at, but there's no real concrete information there. So that's what I'm kind of apologizing to people who, it might deflate them a little bit, but don't feel discouraged because there is a real phenomenon. It's just that nowadays it's much more rare than you think it is. Go back to the original information. There's so much gold there to mine, so much important information that it'll spin your head and you will never land again. This is why I'm doing what I'm doing right now, because of that alone. So I owe me being here right now discussing these things because of that phenomenon. So I will always believe that there will be real crop circles. I believe in the source totally, because one of the greatest things that ever happened to me was when I was levitated in the middle of a crop circle in 1996, and that's how I ended up writing all these books.
I do want to take this opportunity to invite you back to the show so we can open up this subject and discuss crop circles.
Oh no! Twist my arm.
Yeah, I know. And the book is called.
Twist my arm and send me a pre-CBS Fender Stratocaster with ebony fretboard.
I'm looking at one hanging on my wall.
I hate you.
Yeah. But it doesn't have hot rails. It doesn't have hot rails. But the book that Freddie and I are talking about, it's called Secrets in the Fields. And you can certainly go and check it out over at his website.
In fact, very quickly,
Temple.
Jimmy.
Yes.
Now that we bring this up in the topic, there is, on the last chapter, I do bring up the crop circles. And there was one particular formation that happened back in 95 where it was a real one, which showed the Earth missing. It was a mirror image of the solar system, 99.9% accurate. And it gives you 3 dates. And one of the dates, which is in the future, it comes up in the range of 2030 to 2040. So I'm not going to ruin the punchline for you. It does give you a sense that there's a big catastrophe on its way, which can be averted. There is an antidote to all of this. And I'm suddenly picking up information from NASA, who is obsessed with asteroids, as you may have noticed recently, every week. There's another mention of near-Earth stuff. They're completely obsessed with what's going on in the sky. And I've met these people, and they said, it's funny how we appear to be reliving what our ancestors were doing thousands of years ago, watching the sky for incoming projectiles. And there's a lot of mathematicians predicting also that in this torrid meteor stream that once was part of the big deluge that wiped out this ancient civilization, in 2 decades from now, we are facing some potentially big catastrophic scenarios. So there is a warning there in the crop circles too, which is why it's so important to know which ones are real and which ones are fake. So that's also in one of the chapters of the book.
Yeah, thank you so much. And again, it's invisibletemple.com. The links are over at Jimmy Church Radio. But I did mention at the top of the show about the date of 2060 that NASA is talking about, where we're in 2029 is when this big, what is the Egyptian god of war? I forget the name of the asteroid. It's going to be 23,000 miles from us. But if it passes through a very specific tiny window as it passes Earth, and it's just meters square, right? But if it passes through that, then we will have a direct impact in 2060. So I want to bring you back. Let's talk about all of this. I find the subject so fascinating. What a great conversation tonight, man. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jimmy. You're the only church I go to.
You're the only Silva that is ever going to be on this show. Thank you so much, Freddie.
Don't thank me.
Enjoy the rest of your night.
Thanks, Jimmy.
Thank you. Freddie Silva. Again, his website is invisibletemple.com. The links are over at jimmychurchradio.com. And what a fantastic conversation tonight. I'm going to take a quick break. And when I come back, I haven't done this for what is now almost 2 weeks. I am going to open up the phone lines and speak to all of you. So we'll do open lines for this last segment. We're not going to have Fader Night this week, so we'll do it for the next half hour. Thank you so much, Freddie. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. This is Fade to Black. I'll be right back with your phone calls after this short break. Stay with me. All right, welcome back. Fade to Black. Thank you, Freddy Silva. That was a conversation right there. All right, open lines. I haven't had open lines. I don't even know when the last time we opened up the phone lines. 747-228-2051. I can't even believe I'm saying it. Open lines. 747-228-2051. And, we're not going to have Fader Night this week because we're going to have the crew in from the film Extraordinary, The Seeding, which we had to reschedule from last week. And we didn't have Fade to Black or Fader Night last week. And so there you go. 747-228-2051. What a great conversation. Learned a lot tonight. I mean, I can't, I was taking notes all night and I was looking at your guys' post where I'm sitting here, at attention. I just, unbelievable. So, the one thing that seems to be unescapable right now is that date. And that date is 11,000 BC, 10,500 BC, over and over again. The flood myths and the stories that go back, they're cross culture. And to say that it all started with Noah and the Bible is becoming more and more untrue, right? It's extraordinary to me. It's unbelievable. All right, 747-228-2051. Open lines right now. This is Fade to Black. I'm your host, Jimmy Church, and let's go straight to the phones. Hi, you're live on Fade to Black. Who's calling?
Hello?
Hi, you're live.
Hi, Jimmy. Hey, this is Trippy Hippie.
Hi.
Hey, bud. Say, what we just listened to is the truth, what you heard tonight. I can't be more specific than that, but just
well,
I
okay.
want to put it out there.
Well, what part?
What part?
I
we're
mean,
called the red-haired people.
Yeah,
We're the red-haired people.
Right. That if I read that one more time from some culture around this planet, I don't know what I'm going to do. And we talk about, giants in America, of course, the stories throughout Central and South America, up to the Anunnaki, and even the Bible itself makes these references. But it's over and over again. I remember, check this out. I remember when I was a kid, I saw an advertisement, and I want to say it was at my neighbor's house, but it was of a giant skeleton on display at the Field Museum in Chicago. That was, I want to say it was 10 foot. But I saw this, and then I've seen it a couple of times over the last 20 or 30 years. I can't find any reference to it anymore online or anywhere. But apparently they had it on display all the way through like the 1950s in Chicago. Now gone, like erased, right? But it's
gone underground.
It's gone in the back room, into the basement.
Yeah, way back.
But yeah, I find that just so fascinating. But yet historians just want to say it's imagination, right? It's just storytelling.
May I interrupt, Jimmy? Let me just put one thing out there. Indigenous people, we all have our stories, as we just heard. And the red-haired people have passed this down with their descendants. So now is the time for it to come forth, and the descendants are coming forth. And we are uniting the tribe of man. That is our mission.
So well said. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
All right, Trippy Hippie.
All right.
I'll talk to you. Have a good night.
Sir. You have plenty. Take care.
Have a great night. It's a great phone call right there. It's a great phone call. Let's stay on it. Hi, you're live on Fade to Black. Who's calling?
Hi, this is Janine Basald.
Hi, Janine. How are you?
I'm doing okay. It sounded like you were just talking to somebody, but did you get cut off?
No.
That's weird. Okay, I don't know what happened. It was weird.
Okay. So what's on your mind? Great conversation tonight. Freddy Silva is amazing.
Yeah, he is. Like I said, I've seen so many and heard so many different truths from different people, and it's absolute truth to them because it was revealed to them, but it conflicts with somebody else's truth. And so it's kind of like, it's like somebody replied to me, just, keep your mind open, take what resonates with you and leave the rest. And that's what I do. It just, just from an objective point of view, it's kind of like, how come there's so many different versions of truth? You know what I mean?
I do. And this is the most fascinating part about all of this, is that if you go back 3,000-4,000 years before, and if you listen to the historians, Janine, where they'll tell you that there were no transoceanic cultures, right? That everybody was, they may have had boats, but they were on rivers, or they stuck to the shorelines, but the cultures around the world were not transoceanic. But yet, they share not only the same stories and the same traditions, but in most cases, if not all, the same architecture, the same building techniques, the same icons, the same basic things like stairs, windows, construction, roof, where they were not sharing architecture and information, or were they, right? Or, were the Egyptians, people from the Middle East, or the Phoenicians, or the Anunnaki, traveling the world and teaching the same very basic fundamentals and building and leaving that knowledge behind after they left, so that the architecture and I'm talking about pyramids, temples, 3 doors, celestial readings, the zodiac. This was somehow transported across the oceans and across continents to people that weren't, if you listen to historians, were not in communication with each other. But somehow they shared the same information. And that's why when you have somebody like Freddy Silva, start connecting the dots. You know what I picture, Janine? When you see those crime dramas on TV, right? And they're chasing down a serial killer or the mafia or some crazy thing, and they've got the big pin board on the wall with all the photographs and phone records and whatever, bank statements, but they've got the pins with the string, right? All over that board, right? And they figure out the mystery. It's the same thing when we're talking about cultures around the world and Egypt and Thoth and the Anunnaki, and you're got the strings going all over the place, and they keep connecting to each other. They go to Pumapunku, they go to Easter Island, right? They go to Australia, they go to Egypt, they go to Göbekli Tepe and to Stonehenge. And they're constantly going back to the same exact regions of the planet where obviously somebody was communicating and somebody was teaching. So there you go.
Well, maybe they were being taught by the same visitors.
That's right. Yeah. And I think I
don't know. Maybe that's exactly what you were saying, but I was saying it in different words.
No, you were. I'm agreeing with you. Is what I'm doing. Oh, okay. I'm agreeing with you. But that's why guys like Freddy Silva and Graham, and Robert Schoch and Robert Bivall and Colin Andrews and all of these, that have been researching ancient. The list is really long of researchers that have covered this over the years. John Anthony West. And he brought up Chance Gardner and actually last night, Laird Scranton, who's another great historian that have been connecting these dots. And I just find it the most fascinating. It's just like, how can we be in such denial about this? So there you go. I got to get to some more phone calls.
Hey, Jimmy, I just wanted to thank you and Rita for your contribution to my GoFundMe campaign. Have you been seeing the posts?
I've seen a couple, but I've certainly posted about it too as well. But you're more than welcome, and anything that we can do, Janine. All right.
Okay, I was just kind of hoping that you might have. I didn't know that you had even seen it. I apologize for.
Oh, have a great night, Janine. Okay.
Thanks, Jimmy.
Yeah, thank you, Janine. And Janine's absolutely right, though. It's like historians are in denial, right? Where we have, I forget the name of the bowl. Somebody can post it up here in Twitter. I forget the name of the bowl that was found down in Bolivia that's got Sumerian text on it. And what clearly is, what looks to me to be, and maybe Enlil, or a Sumerian, an Anunnaki god with the beard. It's not from the culture of South America, And you have this bowl. It's in a museum now, but it's got cuneiform Sumerian text in it. It's like, how did that get there? Let's go back to the phones. Hi, you're live on Fade to Black. Who's calling?
Hi, Jimmy. It's Charlene.
Hi, Charlene.
From Pennsylvania.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Well, great conversation tonight, and I can't believe I got to open up the phone lines. It seems like forever since I've spoken to everybody. The Magna Fuente Bowl. Thank you so much, Eddie, in Pennsylvania. What is it about the knowledge and the big brains of Pennsylvania, Charlene?
I don't know, but the show was fabulous, and I haven't heard so much great information from a guest in a long time. Not that all your guests are great, because they are. But you know what I think he did? I think he solved the mystery, possibly. And when he was talking about the Shining, the Anunnaki being known as the Shining, and them having problems with their skin,
right,
and having to put oil,
right.
Do you think that might be what they carried around in their purses?
I meant the purse mystery, right?
Very possibly.
The purse mystery. Okay, now I like where you're going with this. So
Some
you
type
heard
of salve
okay.
That wasn't,
right? Maybe it was CBD.
Yeah, how about that?
Okay, so tonight you got that. But before tonight, what did you think was in those purses?
Some type of technology.
That's what I'm thinking.
But they have the watches. They wear the watches.
They do wear watches.
Which I find very interesting that Apple brought out the watches, and I thought, wow, guess they've known about that a long time.
Well, when you, by the way, got word tonight from the Hollywood Reporter that Matrix 4 is now in the works, and we're going to see Neo and Trinity reunited in Matrix 4. But okay, so let's go back to like a scene in the Matrix when Neo's walking up the street. He sees the lady in the red dress, right? Okay. But walking past him are the crowds, the hordes on the sidewalk, all carrying briefcases. We have an image of people with briefcases throughout history, right? The briefcase. And what is in that briefcase? It doesn't matter who or even what part of the planet. What's in the briefcase but knowledge? No matter who you are, right?
Right.
You're carrying the knowledge with you. Diplomats, military people, corporations, company people, anthropologists, scientists, right? The briefcase carries knowledge. That's what's in there. So when you see these images of these kings and these gods carrying a purse, a briefcase, we're calling it a purse, that to me, they're carrying their notes, the knowledge, the information, and they're showing up.
Or they were carrying their oil.
Or they're carrying the CBD. But I'm being very serious about this, though. You know, do you remember, let's go back to the 80s when you had your car that had the pull-out stereo, right? So you remember that? And you took your stereo with you. You pulled it out of the car. You remember doing that, right?
Oh, not really, actually.
You didn't have a pull-out stereo? How young are you?
I had a Triumph Spitfire, and I had a radio.
Oh, a Triumph Spitfire. That's a nice car. Was it purple?
It was royal blue with a black convertible top.
Yeah.
It was my first car.
Yeah. My parents had a Triumph Stag, which was the big brother to the Spitfire. It was a V8. Looked the same, just a little bit bigger, right? It actually had a back seat. I love Triumphs. But back to what I'm trying to say here, like a removable hard drive. You know, that's it. It's knowledge. It's data. That's what those purses and those briefcases were about. I've always thought that. I mean, I don't know how else.
You could be right.
Yeah.
You could be right.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, look, you carry a purse.
Yes, I do.
You carry a purse. What's in your purse? Your world.
Everything I need.
That's right. That's right. And no matter where you show up, you put the purse down and you know you've got your stuff with you. It's the same thing. You know, that is not a bag, a bag of seeds. You know, it could be DNA. It could be anything, but it's knowledge. And that's where I'm going with that, and to see it over and over again. But I like the oils, though. I mean, it could be.
They look sort of small in the carvings, don't they?
Well, so a hard drive is small.
This is true.
Yeah. You know, a cell phone is small. There's a lot of data in a cell phone. You know, an iPad is small. A laptop computer is small. I'm just saying it's knowledge. It's not a fashion statement. I
never thought it was a fashion statement, but
yeah.
I always felt there was technology in there, but he made me think, wow, if they need this oil, like we need sunscreen now, maybe that's what they carried with them.
Oh, man. I'm going to say this is about 2 months ago. We had a heat wave. And Rita and I, like, we don't have heat waves every day, but we had a heat wave. And we had gotten notice from all the local weather people here in Southern California. Like, it was going to be over the weekend. It's going to be like 105, 110 for a week. And Rita wanted to do a bunch of yard work, plants, and do things. And she literally, I'm not joking, I am not kidding, went to the store and got every type of sunscreen, right? Creams and sprays. And she comes, I'm in the backyard, and she did it. She came up to me, my face, my nose, my forehead. I had this white face on around my neck, up and down my arms. And I just took a look at myself. I'm like my dad in 1975 at the lake.
Well, it's really important now. She's definitely looking out for you.
I didn't burn.
Say the UVC numbers are off the charts.
Yeah.
That's the burning radiation.
I didn't burn.
Yeah.
Why is it that and I was talking to Rita about this. When we were kids, getting sunburns and peeling and going through all of that, wasn't that just like a part of life? Why is it such a big deal today?
I think it's far worse today.
Do you think so?
I think it's far worse, yeah. And I've heard a lot of landscapers and whatnot saying their crews are getting burned like they've never been burned before. Yeah.
So,
and yeah, we were out in the heat index of 100 doing landscaping as well. It's no fun.
Right. Well, I mean, it seemed like, getting sunburns were just something that you didn't really complain about. And I'm talking about when we were kids, But today, I don't know if sunburns are really a part of life anymore because everybody does sunscreen. And I don't know. Maybe I've missed it. Maybe people still do get sunburns, but not like when we were kids. Everybody was peeling and burnt and red and toasted.
I guess you're right. When we rode our bicycles around the whole township and came in by dark, like you said in the past show.
I miss those days. I miss those days. When you went outside and played with the neighbor kids, your mom, your dad, they didn't know who you were playing with, right? You just went out and did the adventure. Today, if you're going to go out and play with kids, you need to make an appointment. You need to meet their parents. You need to have a play date, right?
What a shame.
It doesn't go on in the front yard. Like, I just don't get that. I don't know how we got to this point, and I don't want to sound like some old curmudgeon and some complaining old dude.
I feel very sorry for the children of today. I'm your age exactly, so I know what you're talking about. And kids today have it really rough.
This was the rule that we had. I'm sure it was the same in Pennsylvania, if that's where you were raised. But this was the rule. You come home when the street lights come on. But if they don't come on, don't come near this house, right? It's like, that was the rule. And if you came home early, what are the street lights on? No? Okay, well, the front door closes. And that was the rule, right? There wasn't any other rule but that. The streetlights came on, you were expected to be back home and checking in. But we'll never, ever have that rule again. If you have that, you know what? If you're a parent and you have that rule, you would suggest that to your kids today, you would go to jail. You would go to jail. Could you imagine that headline? Her mother said, "Come home when the street lights come on." She was arrested today and will be arraigned tomorrow in court for child endangerment. But that we'll never get back to that. Charlene, thank you so much. Thank you so much. What a great conversation.
Thank you. It was a great show.
Have a great night.
Have a good night, Jimmy.
You too. Thank you so much.
Okay. Bye-bye.
What? Taking phone calls. Oh, man. Oh, I missed Fade to Black so much. The most wonderful audience. The Fadernauts are the best. I do, before I get out of here tonight, I do want to thank Ronnie McMullen over at Life Change Tea. I want to thank, of course, the Shads over at River Moon Coffee, Juanita and Jeff, for everything that they have done to all of you, not only with your advice, but your support and all the healing energy. Before somebody says, "Oh, man, healing energy, awake, love, and light." You know what? I know that I had thousands of you focusing. And you know what? I feel great. And I want to thank all of you for the support and for being here. It was a rough one. It was. And for me to go to open lines right now, I honestly, last week, I thought that we were going to have to take this week off too. I was as surprised as anybody to wake up Sunday morning going, "Oh, man, I feel great." And so realistically speaking, I went through 7 days when it could have been 21, 14 days, 21 days. But something worked. So I want to thank all of you, and of course Ronnie McMullen and Juanita and Jeff too as well. All right, so with that, I am going to get out of here. We have got still the other half of the week coming up here on Fade to Black. Tomorrow night, right here, Francisco Osa, life coach, first time on the show, and it'll be the first visit of many here on Fade to Black. And then Thursday night is Extraordinary, The Seeding, with director Joe Semple and writer Jack Roth, right here on Fade to Black. But tomorrow night, no Fader night on Thursday, but tomorrow night we'll be taking your calls with Francisco. And with that, I am out of here. That will conclude another episode of Fade to Black. Fade to Black's executive producer is Rita Camurian. Show is produced by Hilton J. Palm, Renee, Dennis, and Bob. Announcers are Steve Harder, Gene Vitola, Mark D. Kovar. Webmaster is Drew the Geek. Music, Doug Aldrich. Intros, Spaceboy, spaceboymusic.com. Fade to Black is produced by KJCR for the Game Changer Network. Syndication is KGRA, The Planet. This broadcast is only copyrighted 2019 by Fade to Black and the Game Changer Network. It cannot be rebroadcast, downloaded, or copied or used anywhere in the known universe without written permission from Fade to Black or the Game Changer Network. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. Until tomorrow night, I want everybody to be safe. Go Beckley Tepe.